My dear friends, people I greatly respect often ask me to write something about poverty, social inequality, or similar issues. These topics are constantly brought up during election campaigns, in parliamentary speeches, university theses, editorials, Barroom debates, and international conferences of so-called experts. It's a conversation where nearly every human being, by birthright, feels entitled to weigh in. Yet, because of the sheer number of voices trying to be heard, each person only gets a chance to speak if they stubbornly cling to their right not to listen. That's precisely why I've always believed my greatest contribution to improving the condition of the disadvantaged would be a Spartan abstinence from opinions. However, this doesn't mean I haven't thought deeply about the issue. I have, but without any real hope of arriving at sweeping diagnoses or proposing grand solutions. Driven by a kind of obsessive caution born from conscious ignorance, I thought that before soaring into lofty opinions, it would be wise to first collect a few basic, easily confirmed observations. These observations may be simple, but their general scope is broad enough to be useful for future, more ambitious reflections. So instead of offering opinions, allow me to provide you with a list of these findings. From the perspective of a historian, poverty and inequality are the most general and enduring conditions of humanity on Earth. They are not some rare anomaly that crops up here and there against a universal backdrop of prosperity and equality. Nor are they some mutation following a documented era of wealth and fair distribution. The notion of primitive communism is as much a mythical speculation as Hesiod's Golden Age. Before 18th century Europe, there was never a widespread, radical, and growing revolt against social inequality in any of its forms. That revolt, starting in France, came hand in hand with the belief in the possibility of a society fully designed by an enlightened revolutionary elite. The idea of a planned society has undergone many changes since that, but every attempt to bring it to life has resulted in levels of poverty and social inequality unimaginable to previous generations. The most radical of these experiments, China's Great Leap Forward, starved 30 million people to death in just one decade, arguably the worst economic disaster of all time, only comparable to natural catastrophe. In Soviet Russia, after 7 decades of communism, the average citizen consumed less protein than a czar subject, and had fewer means to acquire a car than a black man in apartheid South Africa. Only those nations that embraced capitalism head-on managed to significantly raise their standard of living. However, in many countries, prosperity came with the growth of the bureaucratic state, resulting in a mixture of capitalism and socialism, what we generically call fascism, a system that almost inevitably leads to self-destruction through war. Since the 18th century, hopes for a better life for the poor often been tied to the expansion of civil and political rights. However, in many countries, these two goals have come into conflict, with liberty being sacrificed in the name of equality, or equality in the name of liberty. Only one country has managed to maintain a consistent path of economic growth and steadily reduce poverty without sacrificing individual freedoms: the United States of America. Whether by coincidence or not, the US was also the country where the doctrine of a planned society was met with the most skepticism and hostility, gaining some traction only during periods of intense military activity, under Presidents Woodrow Wilson, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Lyndon B. Johnson. Since Johnson's era, however, the trend toward increased state control and restricted freedoms in the US has dangerously accelerated over the past few decades, with or without simultaneous military engagement. This trend is closely linked to projects for a new world order, heavily supported by an elite of meta-capitalists. These individuals are more than willing to sacrifice significant portions of America's national sovereignty to achieve their dream of a globally planned society. The mortal conflict between globalism and American national interests, an epoch-defining fact, is entirely unknown to the Brazilian public, thanks to the massive ignorance, often willful, of the journalistic class and that breed of parroting monkeys with the brains of donkeys and the souls of vipers who call themselves intellectuals. Many books have been written on this subject. The most accessible source is Henry Lamb's website, /dub.net, which will open a world of information to the curious reader. Today, the promise of eliminating poverty and social inequality across the globe, repeated so often that it has stirred up explosive impatience everywhere, is broadcast mainly by the proponents of the globalist project, the most notorious mouthpiece being the United Nations. From this same source come other associated projects, such as the global standardization of education, global ecological control, and an administrative fusion of all religions into some kind of planetary spiritual management. While I won't offer opinions on the UN's economic plans, which I haven't studied in depth, I'm certain they are not separate from these other projects. After all, globalism is global, it's holistic, a unified vision built over half a century, not some patchwork quilt of improvisations. Just like in the 18th century, the utopia of equal progress is today wrapped up in a comprehensive civilizational project to be carried out through centralized planning. The difference is that the philosophers have become bureaucrats. They now hold decision-making power, have unlimited financial resources, and operate on a global scale. A brief glance at the Index of Economic Freedom is enough to show that the highest levels of poverty and social inequality are found in places with the greatest state interference and planned economies. The argument in favor of global economic planning is that these plans failed because they were implemented at the national level and faced challenges that transcended national borders. The solution, they claim, is to universalize the plans, and then everything will go wonderfully. The globalist agenda is not the same as the worldwide expansion of capitalism, a historically spontaneous process to which globalism has latched on parasitically. Just as happened on a national scale in several countries, where the growth of capitalism led to the rise of meta-capitalists and the proliferation of their natural allies, the bureaucrats, and activist intellectuals. In this sense, Karl Marx's prophecy that capitalism would produce its own gravediggers proved correct, with the caveat that this role didn't and couldn't fall to the proletariat, but rather to the most politically ambitious segment of the capitalist class and the intellectuals, in the expanded Gramscian sense of the word. This caveat was timely diagnosed and expressed by Fabian socialists, especially Bernard Shaw, which is why it's no surprise that Fabianism has become, formally or informally, the dominant ideology among globalist bureaucratic elites. The seemingly insoluble tension between capitalist expansion and worldwide bureaucratic centralization is at the heart of the aforementioned conflict between the US and globalist organizations. Just like the globalist proposals in education, ecology, and religious culture, topics I'll analyze in another article, the promise of worldwide poverty elimination is part of the globalist ideological discourse, and to it, there is no practical mechanism for realization, other than those already set in motion by the worldwide expansion of capitalism, to which globalism ultimately adds a parasitic element: the growing costs of an increasingly intrusive, paralyzing, and counterproductive planetary bureaucracy. The struggle against poverty and social inequality is now at its peak. On one side, the radical revolt against these age-old problems has become so ingrained in the collective mindset that there is now an insane expectation of global solutions in a relatively short time frame. On the other side, this very expectation fuels the growth of a global bureaucracy that siphons off the fruits of capitalism's worldwide expansion, pursue its own political objectives, slowing down the distribution of its benefits to billions of needy human beings. In this panorama, Brazil is nothing more than a leaf carried by the storm, unable not only to control its destiny, but even to understand it, thanks to the overall ineptitude of our intellectuals, who rank among the most unprepared, frivolous, pretentious in the world. Now that I've sketched this picture, to the best of my ability, and while acknowledging any inaccuracies due to the haste of journalistic writing, I will allow myself to offer an opinion. Like any other human being, I wish for a better life for everyone. But unlike most, I don't believe we should expect substantial progress toward that goal in the coming decades, despite all the advances in agricultural and industrial technology. The tension between capitalism and globalism won't necessarily result in global tragedy, but it's almost impossible for it not to eventually lead to military confrontations with incalculable consequences. Capitalism is a force of expansion. Globalism is a force of contraction. In alchemical symbolism, they correspond to mercury and sulfur, the production of the result. Alchemically, the salt is an infinitely delicate, subtle, and complex process, more subject to chance and divine providence than human will. In this, devout attention, patience, prudence, and a constant search for understanding are far more useful and necessary than programs and slogans. This is especially true for countries that, lacking any real voice in the process, can only hope to adapt advantageously to whatever circumstances arise. Unfortunately, it's precisely in these countries that the breed of intellectuals who love slogans and catchphrases proliferates most uncontrollably.